Every civilization creates stories to explain order, and just as carefully, it creates villains to explain why that order eventually fails. In Norse mythology, where the universe itself is destined to end in fire, flood, and collapse, the need for a singular figure to carry blame becomes almost inevitable. That figure, more than any other, is Loki. Across centuries of retelling, Loki is remembered as the deceiver of the gods, the architect of Ragnarök, and the force whose betrayal leads directly to the fall of Asgard. His name is spoken alongside images of fire and treachery, and his legacy is framed as a cautionary tale about chaos unchecked. This version of Loki is familiar, efficient, and emotionally satisfying, because it allows the destruction of the world to feel personal rather than structural. But the Norse myths themselves tell a far more complicated story, one that becomes impossible to ignore once the layers of later interpretation are stripped away. When the original sources are read carefully, Loki does not appear as a mindless agent of destruction, nor as a figure driven by cruelty for its own sake. Instead, he emerges as a deeply embedded participant in the survival of the gods, a problem solver whose methods were unsettling, but whose results repeatedly preserved the very order he is accused of undermining. The question, then, is not whether Loki caused chaos, but why chaos was so often necessary for the gods to continue ruling at all. And more importantly, why the same actions that once saved Asgard were later reframed as unforgivable crimes once they exposed truths the gods no longer wished to confront. This is not the story of a simple villain. It is the story of a system that depended on a disruptor and then punished him for fulfilling that role too well. To understand Loki, it is necessary to abandon the modern expectation that myths assign clear moral alignments. Norse mythology does not operate on a binary of good and evil, but on tension, balance, and inevitability. The gods are not paragons of virtue, and the giants are not embodiments of pure malice. Each represents a force within a universe that is always moving toward collapse, always negotiating between stability and destruction. Within this framework, Loki exists not as an outsider invading the system, but as a component woven into it from the beginning. His actions consistently arise at moments when the gods face failure through their own rigidity, arrogance, or short-sightedness. Time and again, Loki intervenes where strength fails and foresight proves incomplete, using intelligence, adaptability, and moral flexibility to resolve crises the gods themselves created. But intelligence that exposes flaws is rarely celebrated for long. It is tolerated only until it becomes inconvenient. The bedtime version of Loki's story tells us that he was always untrustworthy, that his downfall was inevitable because of his nature, and that the gods were justified in chaining him beneath the earth. But this narrative collapses under scrutiny, because the same gods who later condemned Loki repeatedly relied on him at moments when their survival was at stake. Loki retrieved treasures that defined divine authority, engineered solutions to impossible dilemmas, and used deception not to undermine Asgard, but to preserve it. He was welcomed into the inner circle of the Aesir, trusted with secrets, and permitted a proximity to power that no true enemy would have ever been allowed. His eventual punishment was not the result of a single betrayal, but of a gradual shift in how the gods perceived accountability. As the end of the world drew closer, the gods began to fear not only external threats, but the truths that Loki embodied, truths about their dependence on chaos, their hypocrisy, and the fragility of the order they claimed was eternal. In this sense, Loki becomes less a destroyer of worlds and more a mirror held too close for comfort. This script will follow Loki's story not as a linear descent into villainy, but as a slow erosion of trust between a figure who understood the universe as it was and gods who insisted on seeing it as they wished to be. It will trace his origins between worlds, his partnership with Odin, his role in shaping Asgard's greatest triumphs, and the moment when his usefulness turned into liability. Most importantly, it will examine Ragnarök not as Loki's crime, but as the inevitable consequence of a system that punished truth-tellers while clinging to comforting illusions. Because when the world finally ends in Norse mythology, it does not do so because Loki exists. It ends because the gods refuse to listen to what he represents. Long before Loki's name carried suspicion, before Asgard rose high above the worlds, and before the gods believed themselves secure in power, the Norse cosmos existed in a state of deliberate imbalance. Creation itself was not an act of harmony, but of collision. Fire met ice, void met motion, and from that violent convergence, existence emerged not as a finished design, but as a fragile process, constantly threatened by collapse. At the center of everything lay Ginnungagap, the great yawning void, a space of potential rather than emptiness. To the north stretched Niflheim, a realm of ice, mist, and freezing rivers, while to the south burned Muspelheim, a land of fire and unrestrained heat. When the cold winds of Niflheim drifted southward and met the sparks of Muspelheim, the ice began to melt, and from that melting came life, not carefully crafted, but accidental and unstable. The first being to emerge from this convergence was Ymir, the primordial giant, a creature of immense size and unchecked force. From Ymir's body came more giants, born not through intention or order, but through proximity and instinct. Alongside Ymir came out Humla, the cosmic cow, whose milk nourished him, and whose slow licking of salty ice revealed Buri, the first of the gods. From the very beginning, the universe was shaped by contradiction. Giants and gods emerged from the same origin, sustained by the same forces, yet destined to view each other as opposites. There was no moral divide at this stage, only difference. Chaos and order were not enemies, but interdependent conditions of existence. This matters because Loki's story cannot be understood without recognizing that Norse mythology never imagined a universe purified of chaos. Chaos was not an invading threat, it was foundational. Without it, nothing would move, change, or grow. When Odin and his brothers eventually killed Ymir and used his body to shape the world, his flesh becoming land, his blood becoming seas, his bones becoming mountains, they did not eliminate chaos, they repurposed it. The world itself was made from a giant, and the giants did not disappear when the gods claimed dominion. They retreated, reorganized, and remained ever present at the edges of the cosmos. Asgard was not built to erase chaos, but to hold it at bay. From the gods' perspective, this distinction mattered greatly. Their authority depended on the belief that order could be permanent, that the walls of Asgard, the laws of the Aesir, and the prophecies they half understood could stabilize a universe that was, by its nature, unstable. The gods ruled not because chaos was gone, but because they believed they could manage it. The giants, meanwhile, represented what the gods feared most, not evil, but inevitability. They embodied natural forces that could not be negotiated with indefinitely: winter, fire, decay, entropy. The gods fought them not because they were immoral, but because they were reminders that control was temporary. It is within this unresolved tension that Loki is born. Loki does not emerge from Asgard, nor from the heart of Jotunheim alone, but from the space between definitions. His father, Farbauti, is a giant associated with lightning and sudden destruction,
while his mother, Laufey, is a figure of ambiguous lineage, sometimes described as a goddess, sometimes as a giantess, and sometimes as something that resists classification entirely. This ambiguity is not accidental. It reflects Loki's narrative function before it becomes his curse. Unlike Thor, whose strength reinforces divine authority, or Odin, whose wisdom seeks to preserve it, Loki's intelligence exposes the limitations of both. He understands rules well enough to bend them, and systems well enough to reveal their contradictions. In a universe that depends on tension, Loki is not an anomaly, he is a pressure point. This is why Odin forms a blood bond with him. The oath between Odin and Loki is one of the most overlooked details in Norse mythology, yet it is one of the most revealing. Odin does not merely tolerate Loki, he accepts him as an equal companion, swearing that neither will drink without the other present. This is not an act of charity or foolish trust. Odin, more than any other god, understands that knowledge comes from uncomfortable places. Odin sacrifices his eye for wisdom. He hangs himself from Yggdrasil to gain insight into runes. He seeks prophecy even when it tells him his own death is inevitable. Aligning with Loki fits this pattern. Loki provides access to perspectives the gods cannot afford to ignore, even as they resent them. He understands the giants not as caricatures, but as forces with motives, desires, and leverage. He understands deception not as moral failure, but as strategy. And most importantly, he understands that rigidity is more dangerous to the gods than any external enemy. This is why, in the early myths, Loki is not feared. He is welcomed into Asgard, allowed to speak freely, and invited into the gods' inner councils. His cleverness entertains them, his solutions benefit them, and his ability to navigate hostile situations repeatedly saves them from disaster. At this stage in the myths, Loki is not a destabilizing presence, he is a stabilizing one, precisely because he prevents the gods from becoming complacent. However, there is an inherent cost to this role. A system that relies on a disruptor must eventually confront what that disruptor reveals. As long as Loki's actions fix external problems, lost treasures, offended giants, broken agreements, his methods are forgiven. But as the gods grow more secure, more invested in their image of permanence, Loki's presence becomes increasingly uncomfortable. He reminds them that their power was built on violence, that their order was carved from chaos, that their reign is sustained not by righteousness, but constant negotiation with forces they pretend are beneath them. And in a world governed by prophecy, reminders like this are dangerous. The seers have already spoken. Ragnarök is coming. The gods know this, even if they refuse to accept its full implications. The question is no longer whether the world will end, but how the gods will respond to the knowledge of that ending. Loki, whether intentionally or not, embodies the response the gods fear most: adaptation rather than denial. This is the seed of his eventual condemnation. Not a single act of betrayal, but a growing realization that his way of understanding the universe cannot coexist with the gods' need to believe in their own permanence. Chaos, when externalized, can be fought. Chaos, when internalized, threatens identity. And Loki is chaos that speaks.
In the earliest surviving myths, Loki does not appear as a threat to Asgard, but as one of its most active defenders, though never in the way the gods would have preferred to admit. His role is not to wield weapons or command armies, but to intervene at moments when divine authority falters due to arrogance, carelessness, or brute force applied without foresight. Again and again, it is Loki who steps into situations already spiraling toward disaster, not because he caused them, but because the gods lacked the flexibility to resolve them on their own. One of the clearest examples of this pattern emerges in the story of Asgard's walls.
a myth that reveals how deeply the gods depended on Loki's ability to navigate moral gray zones they publicly disavowed. After the gods established Asgard as their stronghold, they sought to fortify it against the ever-present threat of the giants. A builder arrived, offering to construct walls so strong that no enemy could breach them. But his payment was steep: the goddess Freya, along with the sun and the moon. At first, the gods refused outright. The price was too high, the terms unacceptable. Yet through a combination of pride and impatience, they reconsidered, allowing the builder to begin his work under a single condition: he must complete the walls alone, without assistance, and within a fixed period of time. The gods believed these terms impossible, and in that belief, they revealed their first mistake. They underestimated the builder, who was in truth a giant in disguise, aided by a powerful stallion whose strength accelerated the construction beyond expectation. As the deadline approached and the walls neared completion, panic set in. The gods realized that their agreement, made lightly, now threatened the very order they sought to protect. They turned to Loki, not because he was trustworthy in their eyes, but because he was the only one capable of undoing a bargain they had no legal or physical means to escape. Loki's solution was neither honorable nor straightforward. He transformed himself into a mare, lured the stallion away from the construction site, and disrupted the builder's progress just long enough for the deadline to pass. When the giant realized he had been deceived, Thor killed him, and the gods kept their walls, their goddess, and the celestial bodies intact. The immediate crisis was resolved, but the cost of the solution lingered beneath the surface. Loki's deception was not merely tolerated, it was demanded. The gods condemned dishonesty in principle, yet relied on it in practice whenever their own agreements endangered them. Loki absorbed the moral blame for actions the gods benefited from but refused to claim as their own. This pattern repeats throughout the myths, most notably in the acquisition of the treasures that define divine authority itself. When Loki cut the golden hair of Sif as a joke, provoking Thor's rage, he once again created a problem that required resolution. But rather than allowing Thor's violence to dictate the outcome, Loki journeyed to Svartalfheim, where he commissioned the dwarves to craft replacements not only for Sif's hair, but for the gods' greatest artifacts: Odin's spear Gungnir, Thor's hammer Mjolnir, and Freyr's ship Skidbladnir. These objects were not trivial gifts. They became symbols of divine legitimacy, tools through which the gods asserted dominance over giants and mortals alike. Yet their existence depended entirely on Loki's initiative, negotiation, and willingness to manipulate competing interests among the dwarves. Without Loki's interference, the gods would have remained powerful, but less secure, less mythically complete. And still, Loki received no lasting gratitude. Instead, his actions were reframed as reckless, his motivations questioned, and his contributions minimized. The gods accepted the benefits of his cleverness while distancing themselves from the methods that produced them. This selective memory allowed them to preserve an image of moral superiority while continuing to rely on Loki whenever that image was threatened by reality. Loki's intermediary extended beyond material treasures into the realm of diplomacy and intelligence. He moved freely between Asgard, Midgard, and Jotunheim, navigating social and political landscapes that the gods, bound by pride and precedent, struggled to enter. Where Thor confronted giants with force, and Odin relied on prophecy and sacrifice, Loki employed adaptability, humor, and deception to extract information and diffuse conflicts before they escalated. This made him indispensable, but also increasingly suspect. The gods began to associate Loki not with solutions, but with the discomfort those solutions caused. Each crisis he resolved exposed another weakness in their governance, another instance where brute strength or divine authority proved insufficient. Over time, Loki's presence became a reminder that the gods' power was not absolute, but contingent. It is here that the seeds of resentment take root. Loki did not merely fix problems, he revealed how easily those problems arose. He showed that Asgard's order was not self-sustaining, but constantly at risk of unraveling due to the god's own flaws. And in a culture that prized honor and strength, such revelations were not welcomed. The irony is that Loki never hid what he was. He never claimed moral purity or unwavering loyalty to ideals. His allegiance was practical rather than ideological, grounded in survival rather than reputation. The gods, however, demanded both loyalty and silence, expecting him to operate within boundaries that contradicted the very reason they relied on him. As long as Loki's actions served to preserve the gods' external dominance, his transgressions were forgiven. But as soon as those actions began to illuminate internal contradictions, tolerance gave way to suspicion. This shift marks a turning point in the myths. Loki's cleverness, once celebrated, becomes a liability. His ability to cross boundaries, once an asset, becomes a source of fear. The gods begin to see in him not just a helper, but a reminder of truths they would rather forget. And yet, even as distrust grows, they continue to depend on him. This dependence is not weakness, it is inevitability. A system built on tension cannot eliminate one side of that tension without collapsing. The gods' tragedy lies not in Loki's existence, but in their refusal to accept what his existence implies. That order without chaos is stagnation. That power without accountability is fragile. That prophecy ignored becomes destiny fulfilled. Loki's story does not accelerate toward betrayal at this stage. Instead, it slows, thick with unspoken grievances and unresolved contradictions. The gods sense that something is wrong, but they cannot articulate it without admitting their own complicity. And Loki, increasingly aware of his role as both insider and outsider, begins to recognize that his place among the gods is conditional, temporary, and ultimately disposable. The stage is set not for sudden treachery, but for an inevitable fracture.
As Loki's position within Asgard grows more uncertain, the myths begin to shift their focus from his actions to his consequences. Where earlier stories emphasize his cleverness and utility, later traditions dwell increasingly on what he produces, what follows him, and what his presence brings into the world without his direct intention. This transition is subtle, but it is critical, because it marks the moment when the gods stop judging Loki by what he does and begin judging him by what he represents. In Norse mythology, lineage matters deeply. Bloodlines carry prophecy. Birth is never neutral. To create life is to introduce possibility, and possibility, in a world governed by fate, is dangerous. It is within this framework that Loki's children come to symbolize everything the gods fear about the future they can see, but cannot stop. Loki's most famous offspring are born not from a goddess of Asgard, but from the giantess Angerboda, whose name translates to "she who brings grief." Together, they produce 3 children who will later be named as central figures in Ragnarök: Fenrir the wolf, Jormungandr the world serpent, and Hel, ruler of the realm of the dead. Each child embodies a force the gods struggle to contain: violence, entropy, and mortality itself. What is often overlooked, however, is that at the time of their birth, these children are not criminals, nor are they actively hostile to the gods. They are infants, embodiments of potential rather than action. It is the gods' reaction to their existence that transforms them into enemies. The seers of Asgard deliver a prophecy that these children will one day play a role in the destruction of the gods. Faced with this knowledge, the Aesir respond not with reflection or restraint, but with preemptive punishment. Rather than questioning the inevitability of fate, they attempt to control it through violence and exile, believing that removing the threat will also remove the outcome. Fenrir, the wolf, is brought to Asgard under the guise of supervision. The gods test him with chains, presenting each binding as a game, until they commission the dwarves to craft Gleipnir, a magical ribbon thin as silk but stronger than iron. When Fenrir realizes he has been deceived and demands a guarantee of good faith, only Tyr has the courage to place his hand in the wolf's mouth. When the binding holds, Fenrir bites down, and Tyr loses his hand. The gods celebrate containment, but what they have truly achieved is betrayal.
Jormungandr, the serpent, is cast into the ocean that encircles Midgard, where he grows so vast that he eventually bites his own tail, forming a living boundary around the world. This act, meant to neutralize him, instead integrates him into the structure of existence itself. The serpent becomes inseparable from the world he is meant to threaten. Hel, Loki's daughter, is banished to the underworld, given dominion over those who die of sickness or age rather than glory. She does not rebel, she does not attack, she rules quietly, efficiently, and without cruelty. Yet her realm becomes associated with fear not because of her actions, but because it represents an aspect of existence the gods cannot conquer. Through these acts, the gods reveal something essential about themselves. They are not reacting to crimes committed, but to futures imagined. They punish not behavior, but possibility. And in doing so, they ensure that the prophecies they fear will eventually come to pass. Loki witnesses all of this. He sees his children judged not for what they are, but for what they might become. He sees deception presented as justice, cruelty disguised as necessity, and fear elevated to policy. Most importantly, he sees the gods abandon the very principles they claim to uphold, all in the name of preserving a future they have already been told they cannot escape. This moment marks a decisive break. Until now, Loki's transgressions have been social and political, resolved through cleverness and compromise. But the treatment of his children introduces a personal dimension that cannot be undone. The gods have crossed a boundary, not by attacking Loki directly, but by demonstrating that no bond, no oath, and no shared history can override their terror of fate. The irony is profound. Odin himself has gone to extraordinary lengths to learn about Ragnarök, sacrificing an eye, consulting seers, and hanging from Yggdrasil in pursuit of knowledge. Yet when confronted with the consequences of that knowledge, he chooses not wisdom, but control. Loki, who has always understood that chaos cannot be eliminated, sees this as the beginning of the end. From this point forward, Loki's relationship with the gods changes irrevocably. He is no longer merely tolerated for his usefulness, he is watched. His words are scrutinized. His presence becomes a reminder of uncomfortable truths the gods would rather suppress. At the same time, Loki becomes increasingly aware that the universe he inhabits does not reward loyalty when it conflicts with stability. The gods' order is not maintained through justice, but through fear of change. And in that realization, Loki begins to occupy a different role, not as helper, but as witness. This does not mean he immediately turns against the gods. The myths do not depict a sudden betrayal or a dramatic declaration of enmity. Instead, they show a gradual hardening, a quiet accumulation of resentment and clarity. Loki continues to participate in the gods' affairs, but the trust that once underpinned those interactions has eroded. The gods believe they have contained the threat. Loki understands they have only postponed it. Ragnarök does not begin with violence. It begins with the gods' refusal to accept the limits of their power. And Loki, standing at the intersection of prophecy and experience, becomes the embodiment of that refusal's consequences.
The death of Balder is often described as the moment everything breaks, the point at which the god's fate stops being theoretical and begins to feel unavoidable. Yet, to understand why this event carries such weight, it is necessary to see it not as an isolated tragedy, but as the logical outcome of a system already strained by fear, denial, and moral compromise. Balder is beloved not because he is powerful, but because he represents everything the gods wish to believe about themselves. He is radiant, gentle, wise, and seemingly incorruptible. Where Odin embodies sacrifice and Thor embodies force, Balder embodies innocence. His existence reassures the gods that their order is not only strong, but good. When Balder begins to dream of his own death, the gods panic. Dreams in Norse mythology are not dismissed as imagination. They are warnings, fragments of prophecy that seep through the veil of time. Frigg, Balder's mother, responds with desperation rather than reflection. She travels across the worlds, extracting oaths from every being and object, demanding that they swear never to harm her son. Fire, water, stone, metal, beasts, sickness,
all comply. Balder is rendered invulnerable, and the gods celebrate, transforming their relief into sport. They throw weapons at Balder and laugh as nothing harms him. Spears shatter, stones bounce away, blades fall harmlessly to the ground. What began as fear becomes spectacle. The gods reassure themselves that fate has been outwitted, that prophecy can be nullified through control. Only one thing is overlooked: mistletoe. Too young, too insignificant, too harmless to be considered a threat, mistletoe is exempt from the oaths. In this small omission, the gods reveal their greatest flaw: the belief that danger is always obvious, always loud, always external. Loki notices this immediately. The myths do not portray Loki discovering this information through divine revelation or malice. He observes, he listens, and he recognizes a structural weakness created by the gods' own fear-driven response. Fate has not been defeated, it has simply shifted form. Disguised, Loki approaches Frigg and confirms what he already suspects. Then he fashions a dart of mistletoe and brings it to Hoder, Balder's blind brother, who stands apart from the game, unable to participate. He offers him a chance to join the celebration, guiding his hand, giving him purpose in a ritual that has excluded him. The dart flies. Balder falls. Silence follows. The gods are stunned, not just by Balder's death, but by what it represents. Their attempt to control fate has failed, and in failing, it has implicated them. Balder's death is not the result of an invading enemy or an external betrayal. It is the consequence of their own actions, their own omissions, and their own arrogance. Loki becomes the focus of their rage. This is crucial. The gods do not interrogate their system. They do not question the wisdom of forcing oaths upon the cosmos. They do not reflect on the cruelty of excluding Hoder or the danger of turning prophecy into entertainment. Instead, they locate blame in a single figure whose role has always been to expose uncomfortable truths. Loki did not invent the vulnerability, he revealed it. But revelation is treated as guilt. In the aftermath, the gods attempt to undo what has been done. Hermodr rides to Hel to bargain for Balder's return, and Hel agrees on one condition: that all beings weep for him. Again, the gods rely on consensus and coercion rather than understanding. And again, there is one exception. Thok refuses to weep. Whether Thok is Loki in disguise or a symbolic representation of dissent matters less than what the refusal signifies. Not all loss can be undone. Not all wounds close, and not all truths are softened by communal agreement. Balder remains dead. With this, the gods' tolerance ends. Loki is hunted, no longer as a useful provocateur, but as an existential threat. His earlier deeds are reinterpreted through the lens of Balder's death, recast as signs of inherent treachery rather than situational necessity. The gods no longer distinguish between chaos that preserves and chaos that destroys. All disruption becomes intolerable. When Loki is captured, the punishment inflicted upon him reflects the full extent of the gods' fear. He is bound beneath the earth with the entrails of his own son, while a serpent drips venom on his face. His wife Sigyn catches the venom in a bowl, but when she must empty it, the poison strikes Loki, and his convulsions are said to cause earthquakes in the world above. This punishment is not justice, it is containment. The gods believe that by silencing Loki, by removing the figure who exposes their fragility, they can preserve the illusion of stability a little longer. They do not recognize that in doing so, they accelerate the very end they dread. Because Loki's suffering does not erase prophecy, it fulfills it. Balder's death marks the irreversible turning point, not because Loki acted, but because the gods responded to fear with cruelty and denial. They chose punishment over understanding, blame over accountability, and control over balance. And in that choice, Ragnarök becomes inevitable.
With Loki bound beneath the earth and his voice removed from the councils of the gods, Asgard enters what appears, on the surface, to be a period of uneasy calm. The immediate threat has been neutralized, the scapegoat punished, and the narrative restored to something the gods can live with. Order, once again, feels intact. Yet this calm is not stability, it is stagnation. Loki's imprisonment marks the first time in the myths that the gods exist without an internal counterbalance. For generations, he had served as the force that questioned assumptions, exposed weak agreements, and navigated spaces the gods could not or would not enter. His absence does not create peace, it creates blind spots. The Norse cosmos does not reward stillness. The world tree Yggdrasil continues to creak under the weight of existence, its roots gnawed by creatures the gods no longer monitor, its branches stretched across realms that drift further apart. Without Loki's movement between worlds, communication falters, knowledge becomes siloed. The gods, secure in their walls and rituals, begin to mistake routine for resilience. Meanwhile, the consequences of earlier decisions begin to unfold. Fenrir remains bound, growing stronger in captivity, his rage deepened not by nature but by betrayal. Jormungandr tightens his coil around the world, his presence no longer merely symbolic but structural. Hel rules her realm with quiet authority, expanding not through conquest but through inevitability. Death continues, indifference to divine politics. The gods have not eliminated the threats they feared, they have only removed the mediator who understood them. In Loki's absence, Odin grows increasingly restless. He continues to seek knowledge of Ragnarök, consulting seers and spirits, yet he refuses to act on what he learns. Prophecy becomes obsession rather than guidance. Thor grows more aggressive, confronting giants with greater violence, mistaking force for control. The gods double down on the strategies that once worked, unaware that the conditions have changed. This is the paradox at the heart of Asgard's decline. By imprisoning Loki, the gods believe they have removed chaos from their system. In reality, they have removed adaptability. Chaos does not vanish when silenced, it accumulates. As the world moves closer to Ragnarök, signs of decay become impossible to ignore. Moral boundaries erode, oaths lose meaning, kin slays kin, and trust dissolves even among the gods. These are not sudden catastrophes, but gradual symptoms of a system that can no longer self-correct. Loki's suffering continues beneath the earth, unacknowledged by the gods who imposed it. His pain becomes a constant, rhythmic reminder of imbalance, manifesting as earthquakes that shake the world above. Each tremor is a signal that something unresolved still lives beneath the surface, but the gods interpret these signs as natural disasters rather than warnings. Sigun's devotion offers a quiet contrast to the gods' abandonment. She remains beside Loki, catching the venom that falls from the serpent's fangs, enduring isolation without recognition or reward. Her presence underscores the tragedy of Loki's punishment. It is not only cruel, but unnecessary. Loki is not imprisoned because he cannot be reasoned with, but because the gods refuse to listen. As time passes, the narrative hardens. Loki is no longer remembered as a companion or problem solver, he becomes a symbol, stripped of context, his story simplified into a cautionary tale about betrayal. This mythic revisionism serves a purpose. It allows the gods to justify their fear and absolve themselves of responsibility. But myths, like systems, retain memory even when participants try to forget. The world continues to unravel in ways the gods cannot fully understand, because the one figure who could articulate the pattern is gone. Loki's silence becomes louder than his words ever were. When the signs of Ragnarök finally converge, when winter stretches unnaturally long, when social bonds collapse, when monsters stir and alliances fracture, the gods are forced to confront a reality they have spent generations avoiding. Fate cannot be controlled through suppression. It can only be met with awareness and balance. By the time Loki breaks free of his bonds, the world is already past the point of prevention. His return is not the cause of Ragnarök, it is its confirmation.
He does not emerge as a cackling villain reveling in destruction. He emerges as a figure shaped by suffering, aligned with forces that the gods themselves empowered through fear and cruelty. His leadership of the giants is not an act of sudden malice, but the culmination of a long process of exclusion. Ragnarök is not the moment Loki chooses to destroy the world, it is the moment the world reveals that it has been breaking all along. And in that final act, Loki does not stand alone. He stands as the representative of every force the gods trying to deny, suppress, or exile. The chaos they feared returns, not as an invader, but as a reckoning.
Ragnarök does not begin with Loki's return, nor does it begin with war. It begins, as all endings in Norse mythology do, with neglect compounded over time. The signs had always been present, woven quietly into the fabric of the cosmos, but without Loki's presence in the halls of the gods, no one speaks of them as a pattern. Each omen is treated as an isolated disturbance rather than part of a single unfolding design. The Fimbulwinter arrives not as a sudden catastrophe, but as an extension of choices already made. 3 winters pass without summer, and the natural world reflects the spiritual condition of its rulers. Crops fail, alliances fracture, and survival replaces honor as the primary concern of mortals and gods alike. Oaths lose their power when scarcity takes hold, and brother turns against brother not because of evil intent, but because trust is thinned beyond repair. This is the environment in which Loki re-enters the mythic stage. When his bonds finally break, it is not through brute force or sudden liberation, but through inevitability. The venom that once fell upon his face, the pain that shook the earth itself, becomes the catalyst for release when the balance sustaining his imprisonment collapses. Sigyn's vigil ends not in triumph, but in resignation, as the world she endured suffering to preserve no longer exists in recognizable form. Loki does not return to Asgard seeking reconciliation. There is no mythic reunion, no attempt to reclaim his former place. The gods have already made their choice, and Loki has adapted accordingly. He aligns himself with the forces that were once labeled enemies, not because they are righteous, but because they exist outside the system that rejected him. This alignment is often misunderstood as betrayal, but it is more accurately described as realignment. Loki has always existed between worlds, and Ragnarök simply removes the illusion that such a position can be tolerated indefinitely. The giants, the dead, and the monstrous children he fathered are not aberrations within the Norse cosmos. They are necessary components of its renewal cycle, long suppressed by the gods' obsession with permanence. As the forces gather, it becomes clear that Ragnarök is not a war of good versus evil, but of stagnation versus transformation. Odin rides out to meet his fate with knowledge but without strategy, having spent his reign collecting wisdom rather than applying it. Thor charges toward Jormungandr, repeating a cycle of confrontation that has defined his existence, incapable of imagining an outcome other than mutual destruction. Loki's confrontation with Heimdall is particularly revealing. Heimdall, the guardian of thresholds, represents vigilance without flexibility, perception without interpretation. Loki, the breaker of boundaries, represents movement without containment. Their mutual destruction is symbolic rather than moral, illustrating that extremes cannot coexist indefinitely within a closed system. Throughout Ragnarök, Loki does not gloat, nor does he hesitate. He acts with the clarity of someone who understands that endings are not punishments, but transitions. The fire that consumes the world, carried by Surtur, is not annihilation for its own sake. It is purification, burning away structures that have outlived their purpose. The seas rise, the earth sinks, and the sky fractures, but these events do not signify permanent loss. They signify release. The old world, built on rigid hierarchies and fear of change, collapses under its own weight. What remains is not chaos, but potential. Loki does not survive Ragnarök in the traditional sense, nor does he need to. His function is complete once the cycle resets. The new world that rises from the sea is quieter, less defined, and free of the assumptions that governed the old one. A handful of gods remain,
not as rulers, but as participants in a rebalanced cosmos. In this context, Loki's legacy becomes clearer. He is not the destroyer of worlds, but the agent through which transformation becomes unavoidable. His punishment, his suffering, and his final role in Ragnarök are not marks of villainy, but evidence of a system incapable of integrating contradiction without collapse. Ragnarök is often remembered as a tragedy, yet within Norse cosmology it is also a necessity. Without an ending, there can be no renewal. Without chaos, there can be no adaptation. Loki embodies this truth not through moral superiority, but through structural function. The gods fall not because Loki defeats them, but because they refuse to evolve. And when the world begins again, cleansed and reshaped, it does so carrying the imprint of every choice made before the fire. Loki's legacy lingers not as a figure, but as a principle, embedded in the very fabric of a cosmos that has learned, too late, the cost of suppression. When Ragnarök concludes and the old world sinks beneath the sea, Norse mythology does not linger on mourning. The surviving gods gather in a landscape that is unfamiliar not because it is damaged, but because it is empty of certainty. The cosmos has been reset, stripped of its previous hierarchies, and the silence that follows is not peace, but recalibration. In this renewed world, Loki is absent in body, yet impossible to remove in influence, because systems may fall, but ideas persist far longer than the structures that attempt to suppress them. The new generation of gods inherits a reality shaped as much by Loki's disruption as by Odin's foresight or Thor's strength. The fields grow again, the seas recede, and humanity reemerges. But the myths are careful not to describe this rebirth as a triumph. It is instead a correction, a quieter configuration of existence that bears the scars of its former rigidity. What is missing from this world is not chaos, but arrogance, the belief that permanence can be enforced through dominance rather than balance. Loki's role in this transition is never formally acknowledged by the surviving gods, and that omission is itself telling. Myths rarely commemorate figures whose function exposes systemic failure, because to do so would require admission that the collapse was not caused by a villain, but by collective refusal to adapt. Asgard's downfall is therefore attributed to fate, prophecy, or inevitability, rather than to the long chain of decisions that made alternative outcomes impossible. In the centuries that follow, as oral tradition becomes written record, Loki undergoes a transformation that Ragnarök itself did not complete. His character is gradually flattened, his contradictions simplified, and his narrative repurposed to serve moral instruction rather than cosmological explanation. Where earlier myths presented him as a destabilizing necessity, later interpretations increasingly frame him as a cautionary figure, a warning against deceit, rather than a representation of balance. This shift is not accidental. As Norse societies evolve and Christianity spreads through Scandinavia, mythological figures are reinterpreted through new ideological lenses. Gods, once understood as forces of nature and psychological archetypes, are recast as moral agents, capable of sin and deserving of punishment. Loki, already associated with disruption and transgression, becomes an ideal candidate for this reframing. In this emerging worldview, chaos is no longer seen as complementary to order, but as its enemy. Trickery is stripped of its functional role and reduced to malice. Loki's intellect, once portrayed as adaptive brilliance, is redefined as deception for its own sake. His punishments are emphasized, while his contributions are minimized or omitted entirely. This process of distortion does not erase Loki's importance, but it alters how that importance is understood. He becomes the villain not because his actions are re-examined, but because his existence challenges systems that prefer stability over truth. The god who once revealed uncomfortable realities is transformed into a symbol of corruption, reinforcing the authority of those who write the myths rather than those who inhabit them. Despite this, Loki resists complete erasure. His presence endures in folklore, poetry, and regional traditions that preserve older interpretations beneath later moral overlays. In these fragments, he appears not as a devil-like figure, but as a catalyst, someone whose actions force stagnation into motion. He remains associated with fire, not solely as destruction, but as transformation, the element that reshapes rather than merely consumes. This persistence reveals something essential about the trickster archetype itself. Cultures may attempt to suppress or demonize figures who embody contradiction, but they cannot eliminate the need those figures represent. Every system, whether mythological, social, or political, eventually encounters conditions it was not designed to handle. When that happens, adaptation becomes necessary, and adaptation often begins with disruption. Loki survives in myth because he represents this inevitability. He is the reminder that balance is not achieved through dominance, nor stability through suppression. The gods who attempt to freeze the cosmos into permanence are the ones who trigger its collapse, while the figure who embraces movement becomes the means through which renewal occurs. In this sense, Loki's post-Ragnarok legacy is not one of defeat, but of absorption. His function is no longer localized in a single deity, but diffused throughout the rebuilt world. Change itself becomes the inheritor of his role, embedded into the rhythm of existence, rather than personified in a single contentious figure. Modern interpretations often struggle with this complexity, preferring narratives with clear heroes and villains, clean moral arcs, and satisfying resolutions. Loki defies these preferences because he was never designed to be resolved. He exists to complicate, to interrupt, and to reveal the fault lines beneath seemingly stable surfaces. This is why Loki continues to resurface in contemporary storytelling, philosophy, and psychology, often stripped of his original mythic context, but retaining his essential function. He appears wherever systems resist change, wherever authority fears scrutiny, and wherever truth is inconvenient. His relevance endures not because he is entertaining, but because he is necessary. In the world after Ragnarok, the gods rule less absolutely, humanity lives more cautiously, and the cosmos moves forward without illusions of permanence. That's why Loki's absence is not a victory over chaos, but a sign that chaos has been integrated rather than exiled. And in that integration lies the true legacy of the trickster god.
When modern scholars, psychologists, and mythologists return to Loki, they do not do so out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. Loki refuses to remain confined to ancient Scandinavia because the role he occupies is not historical, but structural. He is not simply a character within Norse mythology. He is a function within any system that claims permanence, purity, or moral certainty. To study Loki is therefore not to study a god, but to study the mechanisms by which power maintains itself and the forces that inevitably destabilize it. Across cultures, the trickster appears wherever authority hardens into dogma. In Jungian psychology, this archetype represents the shadow of consciousness, the repressed truths and contradictions that polite order refuses to acknowledge. Loki fits this framework precisely because his actions consistently expose what the gods attempt to conceal, whether it is their dependence on violence, their fear of prophecy, or their hypocrisy when enforcing laws they themselves routinely violate. Unlike heroes, who reinforce the values of the societies that celebrate them, tricksters interrogate those values by breaking them. Loki's deceptions are rarely random, and they are almost never motivated by destruction alone. Instead, they target moments of stagnation, arrogance, or imbalance, forcing the gods into situations where their assumptions no longer protect them. The discomfort this creates is mistaken for malice, because it threatens not individual gods, but the narrative coherence of their rule. This dynamic becomes especially clear when Loki's punishments are examined through a modern analytical lens. His binding beneath the earth, subjected to perpetual suffering, mirrors historical patterns in which societies neutralize dissent not by disproving it, but by silencing it. The severity of Loki's punishment far exceeds the moral weight of his crimes, suggesting that what is being punished is not action, but function. Loki is dangerous not because he destroys Asgard, but because he reveals its fragility long before Ragnarok makes that fragility undeniable. In political theory, this role aligns closely with what sociologists describe as systemic disruptors, individuals or forces that expose contradictions within power structures.
These disruptors are often labeled traitors, saboteurs, or enemies of stability, regardless of whether their actions prevent greater harm. Loki embodies this phenomenon mythologically, serving as the scapegoat onto whom the gods project their fear of collapse. The gods of Asgard rely heavily on symbols of order, walls, laws, oaths, and hierarchies, yet repeatedly fail to uphold those symbols without Loki's intervention. He retrieves stolen treasures, negotiates with giants, and devises solutions that brute force cannot achieve. This reliance creates an uncomfortable paradox. The very figure condemned as untrustworthy becomes indispensable. Rather than resolving this contradiction, the gods attempt to eliminate it by redefining Loki as irredeemable. Modern retellings often inherit this distortion, emphasizing Loki's betrayals while downplaying his contributions, because narratives that challenge authority remain unsettling even centuries later. Yet contemporary audiences increasingly resonate with alternative interpretations, recognizing patterns that mirror modern institutions. Governments, corporations, and cultural systems frequently punish whistleblowers more harshly than perpetrators, framing exposure as betrayal rather than accountability. Loki's story therefore functions as a mythic case study in how systems defend themselves against self-awareness. He is not feared for what he does, but for what he reveals. Each time Loki speaks uncomfortable truths, the gods respond not with reflection, but with repression, reinforcing the cycle that ultimately leads to their downfall. This perspective reframes Ragnarök itself. Rather than a sudden eruption of chaos triggered by a villain's revenge, it becomes the inevitable consequence of accumulated denial. Loki does not create the conditions for the end of the world, he merely stops preventing it. His final opposition to the gods is not an escalation, but a withdrawal of cooperation. When the force that once compensated for imbalance steps aside, the system collapses under its own weight. In psychological terms, Loki represents the suppressed shadow that returns with destructive force when ignored for too long. Individually, this manifests as unresolved trauma or denied impulses. Collectively, it appears as social upheaval, revolution, or collapse. The myths warn that suppression does not eliminate chaos, it concentrates it. Even in contemporary storytelling, Loki's resurgence reflects growing discomfort with narratives of absolute authority and moral simplicity. Audiences are drawn to characters who occupy liminal spaces, who challenge binaries of good and evil, and who reveal that survival often depends on adaptability rather than righteousness. Loki's popularity in modern media is not accidental. It reflects a cultural moment increasingly skeptical of rigid hierarchies and inherited power. Yet it is crucial to recognize that Norse mythology never fully absolves Loki, nor does it fully condemn him. This ambiguity is intentional. Loki is neither hero nor villain in the modern sense, because those categories are insufficient for the role he plays. He is a mirror held up to the gods, reflecting both their strengths and their failures, and mirrors are rarely welcomed by those who prefer flattering illusions. In the end, Loki's greatest transgression is not betrayal, but honesty in a system that survives on selective truth. His fate serves as a warning not about chaos, but about the cost of refusing to engage with it constructively. When chaos is integrated, it fosters growth. When it is demonized, it returns as catastrophe. The trickster's mirror remains relevant because no society escapes this tension. Order seeks permanence, chaos demands movement, and balance exists only when both are acknowledged. Loki's story captures this truth with unsettling clarity, reminding us that the line between stability and collapse is not crossed by villains alone, but by systems that silence the voices meant to challenge them.
When the Norse myths finally fall silent, they do not end with Loki's scream, nor with his chains, nor even with Ragnarök itself. They end with something far more unsettling, a world that continues without him, forever altered by the absence of the force it refused to understand. The surviving gods rebuild, humanity returns, and the cosmos moves forward. But the myths never describe this new age as wiser, stronger, or more just. They describe it as quieter, more cautious, and stripped of illusion. This is the final irony of Loki's story. The god blamed for ending the world is absent from the world that follows, yet the consequences of ignoring his function remain etched into its foundations. Order persists, but it does so humbly now, aware that rigidity once invited annihilation. The gods rule with restraint, not because they have conquered chaos, but because they have learned, too late, that chaos cannot be conquered at all. Loki was never meant to be a comforting figure. He was not designed to inspire worship, loyalty, or moral clarity. He exists to unsettle, to interrogate, and to destabilize certainty wherever it calcifies into arrogance. In this sense, Loki succeeds completely, because even after his narrative concludes, the questions he raises continue to trouble every retelling of Norse mythology. Why did the gods rely so heavily on a figure they claimed to distrust? Why were his punishments harsher than those of gods whose crimes were far more destructive? And why did the end of the world arrive not when Loki first caused trouble, but when the gods finally decided they no longer needed him? The myths never answer these questions directly, because their power lies in implication rather than instruction. Norse storytelling does not explain, it presents patterns and leaves the listener to confront what those patterns reveal. Loki's arc exposes a system that values obedience over balance, strength over adaptability, and silence over truth, until those values inevitably collapse under their own weight. In this light, Loki's final opposition during Ragnarök is not an act of vengeance, but an act of alignment. He stands with the forces of destruction not because he desires ruin, but because destruction has become unavoidable. The gods ignored every warning, suppressed every contradiction, and punished every disruption until the only remaining path was collapse. Loki does not create that moment. He arrives when it can no longer be prevented. This reframing does not absolve Loki of responsibility, nor does it demand sympathy. Instead, it demands recognition. Recognition that systems fail not because of external enemies alone, but because they refuse internal correction. Recognition that balance requires tension, and that tension requires voices willing to disrupt comfort. Recognition that villains are often constructed not from evil, but from inconvenience. Loki's legacy, therefore, is not his downfall, but his necessity. He embodies the truth that no structure, divine or human, survives by denying its contradictions. The gods of Asgard were powerful, noble, and heroic by any measure, yet they fell because they mistook dominance for stability and obedience for harmony. Loki existed to challenge those assumptions, and for that he was condemned. In the centuries since these myths were first told, Loki has continued to evolve, not because his story changes, but because audiences change. Each generation finds new meaning in his contradictions, seeing in him reflections of dissenters, outsiders, reformers, and truth-tellers who threaten systems by refusing to conform. His endurance proves that the trickster archetype cannot be erased, only misunderstood. Ultimately, Loki is not the god of lies, but the god of inconvenient truths. He reveals what happens when order fears self-examination, when authority punishes adaptation, and when balance is mistaken for betrayal. His story is not a warning against chaos, but a warning against the refusal to engage with it. And this is why Loki remains one of mythology's most enduring figures. Not because he is charming, clever, or destructive, but because he occupies the space most narratives avoid, the space where morality blurs, where systems are exposed, and where the difference between hero and villain depends entirely on who controls the story. In the end, Loki was never meant to be loved. He was meant to be necessary. And when necessity is treated as treachery, the cost is not paid by the trickster alone, but by the entire world that follows. If this story reshaped how you see Norse mythology, then the myths are doing exactly what they were meant to do. Subscribe to continue exploring the gods, giants, and forgotten truths that shaped the ancient world. And when you are ready, the next story waits, because every myth hides another truth beneath the one we were told first.